I think we'll get started. We're not fully complete, but I think we'll get started slowly, and then some more people might join us. It's really such a pleasure to see you here. I'm Dietrich Neumann. I'm the director of this John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here in our first event in this series, Conversations, but also, of course, as you can imagine, the first in-person event for the public that invites the public in for a very long time. And so, as you've noticed, we're in the wonderful house that the Brown family inhabited since the early 19th century. It was then restored, and it was given to, they gave it to Brown in the 1980s, and then it was beautifully restored and then opened up as a center in 1995. And I look at Rob Emlin, who is here, who is, of course, the first director who not only started the center as a director, but he also was the one who oversaw the restoration, which was very complex. And I think it's while it sounds like a joke, but it's, I think, almost close to the truth to say that the building, when you started the restoration, was held together by almost not much more than the outside paint. It needed a full restoration. Of course, we'll hear from Martha Werenfels in a moment about how this all unfolded. And I think Rob lived upstairs during that time, right, and oversaw the whole thing and then became director. And so now I'm the fourth director, and we love this house and we want to sort of make it more visible to the public, an inviting place. I feel that's one of the missions of public humanities, to bring what we do here at Brown to the many publics of the city of Providence, and vice versa, bring the citizens of Providence in here and learn from them and see what's going on. And so we hope to have an artist, architect, writer, thinker, politician every Thursday throughout the semester, and then starting again in January. So it's every Thursday at 6. You can just wander in, or rather, since we have COVID times, sign up online, because we have to limit the numbers a little bit. And so we hope that this will really be one of the most outward-facing parts of Brown University, and make everyone feel welcome here. And we hope that you come often. I should say that I'm always happy to acknowledge the source of inspiration for this idea of having these conversations once a week, which was a series that Christina Bevilacqua started at the Athenaeum down the street, which was immensely successful. And while she has moved on to another location, I think they still continue on doing a lot of events. And I think that's a really great thing, and that inspired me. I actually asked her if I could use the idea for this, and she was very gracious about it and said, go ahead. And she said, well, it's free for everyone to do this sort of thing, and I hope she'll come and also give a talk about her activities soon. So we put, as you can see here, I think a really interesting group of people together. Let me see if I can scroll down. Very interesting artists and local. Here's Priya, wonderful jewelry maker. And here's Bob Azar, who's the deputy planner for the city of Providence, and my dear colleague Bonnie Honig, who's going to talk about her new book, Shell Shocked, and another colleague here, Talia Field. And one of the candidates for mayor will, of course, have all of them come. And Brett Smiley happens to be the first one, but we'll have 3 more in the next round in the spring. And we'll also have a composer here, Eric Nathan, who will play the piano, and we'll sit around and hear his latest composition. So if you have ideas of people who you feel should talk in this, please let me know. The idea is that we have about under a half an hour presentation, then some Q&A, and then we go to the next room and drink some wine and eat some food together and chat some more. We have some COVID rules at Brown, as you know, and you're all fully masked. So the rule is that only the lecturer is allowed to take off the mask. Everyone else should keep it on. Later, when we obviously eat and drink, we can take it off, but should keep a 6-foot distance, ideally, from each other. For that purpose, we also have an outside tent. So we open the door so we can all spread out and chat. And I wanted to recognize, I already mentioned Rob here, and then I wanted to recognize Reese, who greeted you at the door. She's here in the last row. She's from sophomore at Brown from New Jersey, with a great interest in history. That might be one of her major that she has to figure out by the end of the year, I think, what to choose. And I think this is a good place for her because she loves history, and this is one of the most historic places. I think it's the second oldest house on our campus. So that brings me, of course, to our speaker today, Martha Werenfels, an architect, and I think in many ways appropriate to open the series because she oversaw the renovation of this building. We'll hear a little bit about it in the late 80s until 1995, which was, of course, complex and extensive. And she worked with Irving Haynes and Cornelis de Boer. And as you see, the results are really quite splendid. I've known Martha for a long time because our paths crossed when she took a class with me when she got her master's in history at Brown University, adding to her bachelor in architecture from Cornell. And she has long been a senior principal at DBVW Architects, a 30-person firm in downtown Providence. The abbreviation stands for Durkee, Brown, Viveros, and Werenfels. So she's one of the senior principals there. And she has extensive experience in historic preservation projects, several national historic landmarks, rehabilitation of various building types, and has done a number of preservation feasibility studies, and principal architect for restoration projects at Yale, Rhode Island State House, Newport Casino, Cranston Street Armory, the Tabernacle on Martha's Vineyard. But many of you, of course, know her local work, that great tower downtown behind New Rivers, which is really elegant, and the splendid Waterfire Art Center, an amazing restoration of that existing 1926 factory. I think, you also did on our campus the Office of College Admissions and worked on the School of Professional Studies. There are also municipal facilities in Plymouth and Taunton. So it's a really rich portfolio. Martha is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and past president of FAIA Rhode Island, on several boards, among them Historic Preservation Education Foundation, Public Archaeology Lab, and the Rhode Island Historic Preservation Historic District Review Board. So I'm really glad that you were the first one to start our series in this house that you helped to rescue and restore. So please help me welcome Martha Werenfels. Let me just see. I think this looks good. I think so. Yep.
Presentation mode.
Exactly, presentation mode.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a rainy night. Thank you for that great introduction. One point of clarification, when I worked on this house, I was a tiny player. It was like my first job in the private sector. Rob Emlin was our client, and I worked for Irving Haynes and Associates, and I was the newbie. So I definitely didn't oversee it. I hopefully made some contributions, but it was at the very beginning of my career. So Diedrich kindly asked me to talk, and I won't go on and on, but trying to talk in 30 minutes about my career is like, how do you do that? So I tried to pick a few projects, and I tried to weave them together with some sort of connections between very disparate projects. As a preservation architect, the work I do is all over the place, geographically, physically, stylistically, and in terms of time period. So I'm going to try to create a story tonight. Some of the transitions might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm going to give it a shot. I've never given this talk before. So these are sort of teasers about some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And when you look at this slide, you're probably like, what the heck are those things there? And you'll find out. And the right-hand image, my sister saw that picture and she said, Martha, are you running for office? But I'm not. And you'll see why that picture is in there as we proceed. So Diedrich mentioned that I had worked on the Newport Casino. I worked on that building. I have worked on that building for 20 years. And it's been all kinds of crazy projects within the Newport Casino, which most of you probably know is McKim White building in Newport. It was sort of the beginning of the shingle style of architecture. And it's an incredibly famous building and one of my favorite building complexes in Rhode Island, and has been one of my favorite clients over the years. Don't tell any of my other clients that. That's since Rob. Rob was of course the best. So a long time ago, I gave a talk called Preserving the Newport Casino from the Ladies' Room to Backstage, which again is an unusual name for a talk, but it's kind of true because every project has to start somewhere. And my work at the Newport Casino started in the Ladies' Room. The very first project I was hired to do there was in 1997, I think. Yes, I'm that old. And it was a ladies' room restoration. So on the left, you see the before photo. There was this historic restroom, which of course historically was not a ladies' room because originally they didn't have women's restrooms in the Newport Casino, but that's another story. And this bathroom was pretty tired. It had the wall hung sinks that had, you know, crazy stuff hanging from the ceiling. It was not an attractive bathroom. So the first project I did at the Newport Casino was to restore that room. We restored the beautiful encaustic tile on the floor. We put new tile on the walls. We tried to make it feel more of a piece with the rest of the late 19th century Newport Casino. So it all started in the ladies' room. Shortly after we finished that project, there was a terrible fire. I will never forget sitting in my office on West Exchange Street here in Providence and hearing on the radio that the Newport Casino was on fire. And I thought I was going to throw up. I literally felt it like inside. Oh my God, that's such an amazing building and it's on fire. So this 1998 fire was horrible, but fortunately nobody was injured. And the fire was concentrated in the north wing of the Newport Casino. And the north wing was a reconstruction because it had burned in the past. So the portion of the building that was damaged by fire was not the original structure. And the fire was actually put out quite quickly. It began in another building just to the north. An ember flew over an alleyway and found its way into the attic, which was the only space that wasn't sprinklered. The fire was significant and severe, but again, nobody was hurt. As you can see in this photograph, there was a troop of people who took out all the artwork and saved all the artwork and artifacts that were in the building. I don't think any of the artifacts were damaged. So then we had to reconstruct that north wing. And I remember, so we were called back because I was the only architect they knew at that point. It was like, Martha, can you come help us reconstruct the north wing? Sure. And within days I was down there, and the owner of La Forge restaurant, which is still on the first floor of the north wing, was like, we have to be up and running next week. I'm like, oh, well, it's probably not going to be next week, but we'll do everything we can. So we reconstructed the north wing and got them up and running the same summer. The fire was in June, which is right when their season gets going. So that was kind of crazy, but we did put the north wing back together, which is also referred to as the USTI wing. And following that, the folks at the Newport Casino came back and said, well, we have this attic space that we want to convert to an information resource center. We want to have archival storage there. We want to have a place for scholars to do their research. We want to have a reading room, and it's in the attic, which, as most of you probably know, is not an ideal location for archival storage. Archival storage needs very specific parameters in terms of temperature and humidity, and you don't get that in an attic space. But again, I love the challenge, and we said, okay, we'll make this work. So on the right-hand image, you can see the crazy floor plan of the attic. It's all eave space. In the left, you can see that the roof has almost no dormers. So this was all space that had no natural daylight, or very little natural daylight. There was, I think, two windows facing Bellevue Avenue and one tiny little dormer on the backside of that clock tower. But we made it work. The clock tower, which you see on the top side of the plan, is a dodecahedron. I learned that word doing this project. It's a 12-sided figure, and that became the boardroom, but it was attic space when we began, like most of the rest of this floor. When I first walked into the attic of that clock tower, this is what I saw, and I was kind of like, what's that? That's interesting looking. Clearly it was a clock mechanism, but I didn't know anything about it. And as you could see in the previous slide, there's a clock on the outside of the tower. So this was the mechanism that was sitting in the tower to operate that exterior clock, but you couldn't just walk into the tower. You had to sort of crawl behind framing, and there wasn't a clear path to get into the tower. So the only person who ever went back here was the person who had to manually wind this mechanism. So it wasn't on anybody's radar other than the guy who had to wind it every 8 days. And it was just sitting there on this wood framework. So I kind of dusted it off and looked carefully at it. And there's a little tiny plaque on the bottom that said Tiffany. So I said, it's a Tiffany clock. I need to find out more about this because I wanted to create a boardroom where the clock was, which would mean moving the clock mechanism and restoring the mechanism. So I started, this was in the 80s, no, 90s. I started making cold calls. You couldn't look up anything on the internet at that point. I just made cold calls, including a call to Tiffany in New York, to the jewelry store. And I said, I'm an architect in Providence. I found this clock mechanism in a tower that I'm restoring. What can you tell me about this mechanism and who can restore it for me? So I got passed from one person to another, to another, to another, and eventually was connected with a clock restorer in Maine. I'll never forget this family. Is the Balzer clock family. And this family does nothing but restore clocks. And I called them and they said, oh, there are only 1 or 2 Tiffany tower clocks remaining in the whole world. And we'd love to see it. And we'll be down tomorrow to take a look at this mechanism. And they came down and long story short, they took the mechanism up to Maine and completely restored it for us. And what we did was move the clock from the center of the clock tower to the sidewall of the clock tower, to one of the facets of this 12-sided plan. But to do that, we had to reconnect all of the cables that attach to the weights that create that operate this clock. So you can see the close-up of the restored clock on the left. And on the right, you can see it sitting on a new pedestal, which we created, which has the swinging pendulum behind that glass door, which you can see. And then there are cables that go up to weight pockets. And you can see to the right and left of the clock, there are these niches in the wall that we created so that the weight pockets could ride up and down as the clock runs through its sequence. What was particularly interesting about this mechanism and the weights is that they descend through multiple floors. They don't just go up and down the weight pockets that you see here. They drop down behind that bookcase that we designed to accommodate this, and they go down through the first floor of the building as well. This is on the, this is on the 3rd floor. They go down through the 2nd floor as well. So they have really long cables, and when you wind up the clock, it's good for 8 days, and the weight travels through the weight pocket, and by the end of 8 days, you have to wind it again or it loses time. And I think that they were designed to do that. I'm not a clock expert, but I think they were designed with an 8-day cycle, so they had a little bit of wiggle room in case you didn't get there at the proper time on day 7. So it was really fun to find this clock, to find somebody who could restore it, to design a boardroom around it. I remember this was in the early days of architectural renderings too, with a computer. And I remember presenting an architectural rendering to the board of the Tennis Hall of Fame and saying, I would like to convert the attic of the clock tower to a boardroom. And somebody I was presenting to gasped. There was literally an audible gasp in this board meeting. And I heard somebody go, oh, and then I showed the rendering and they kind of went, oh, that looks pretty cool. Yeah, let's give it a shot. So here it is today, again, sitting on the 3rd floor of the Newport Casino. So from there, we were also asked to restore one of the gallery spaces, which used to be this is on the 2nd floor of the Newport Casino, used to be a boardroom, a billiard room. And I was looking at historic photos in terms of how to restore this vaulted ceiling. And I noticed that there was something happening around the perimeter of the ceiling just above that wood wainscot. And when we started to peel away the paint that was on the room that we were refinishing, we found out that the motif was flames, which was a little scary given the fire we had recently restored the building. That had caused the recent restoration of the building. But this flame motif we found this under the plaster, and we had somebody recreate it. This was a while ago, but I believe it was silver, palladium leaf, and gold leaf. So that's why it's silver and gold. And you can see that the original motif even had these little sparks that sort of came off the flame, and our presented on the vaulted ceiling. So that was a bit quirky. And then after that, we had this wonderful opportunity to restore the Casino Theater, which is at the back of the complex. And that could be a whole lecture in and of itself because it was such a cool project. But if you look at this image in the upper left-hand corner, if you haven't been to the Newport Casino, at the back of the complex of buildings, it's multiple buildings, there are these two pavilions connected by a two-story porch. And both of those pavilions are very, very simple from the outside. They look like big barns. They are not architecturally distinctive on the outside, but for their size and their overall form and this beautiful two-story porch that connects the two. The one on the left has a theater inside, a very ornate theater, and the one on the right has a court tennis court. And if you've never seen court tennis, you should go down there and take the tour because it's fascinating. But those are about as different uses as you can imagine in two very, very similar exterior building envelopes. And I think it was part of the genius of Stanford White that he could take these two really simple barn-like pavilions and turn one into a gorgeous theater and the other into a court tennis court, which looks like the original medieval court tennis courts inside. So we completely restored that theater. And as I said, that could be a whole nother topic of a lecture, but it was amazing because there was so much original fabric and original ornamentation left within this theater space that had been vacant for, I think, 20 years when we began this project. So this big hulking building had sat vacant because at some point, I think in the 70s, piece of plastic, it was not heated. It was just a summer use theater and a piece of plaster fell from the ceiling and they said, uh-oh, we have problems. We better shut it down. And it wasn't until 20 or 30 years later that they were able to figure out a funding mechanism to completely restore the theater. And they did that by combining forces with Salve Regina University, which was brilliant because Salve Regina needed a theater for their theater department and the Newport Casino needed a theater and public space for the summertime. So Salve can use the building during the academic year and the Newport Casino and the International Tennis Hall of Fame can use it during the summer. So bringing those two very important nonprofits together in Newport to save one building that they could both use was brilliant. And from a fundraising perspective, they could each tap into their own sort of networks, and it just worked really well. And it was really fun to be able to host one of the statewide preservation conferences in the theater after it was restored, and that's what you see happening on the right. So that's the Newport Casino. You can see in the colorized postcard on the left and in the relatively current image on the right, it has not changed much over time, despite the fact that all these projects have happened there. And in my business of doing historic preservation work, the best projects are the ones where we walk away and nobody knows we were there, like the theater. You're not going to walk in there and go, oh, it looks like this was all just restored. You're going to walk into the building and say, wow, this is beautiful. It's so original and so intact and so well preserved. So we walk away and hopefully nobody knows we've been there. So remember that image of the clock? This is my stretch of a transition to a new project. This aerial image is Plymouth, Massachusetts. If any of you have been there, this is right in the heart of downtown Plymouth. Plymouth Rock would be off to the right on the edge of the harbor. This is right in the middle of downtown with the main street passing just below the yellow circle. In 2014, I think it was, the town of Plymouth put out a request for proposals to architects to do a feasibility study to analyze the building in the yellow circle, which is the 1820 courthouse, and look at all the properties in the red outline and determine whether or not A, the courthouse could be saved, and B, could it be repurposed as a new municipal facility for the town of Plymouth, because the town hall was in a former school and it had outgrown the school. And this was a really important building in the heart of downtown. And there were several buildings behind it. And they wanted to know, they called it the Plymouth Courthouse Corridor. They wanted to know how they could repurpose this whole area. So they put out an RFP for architects. This is often how architectural projects are awarded, especially public ones. We responded to this request for proposals And my firm was shortlisted among several others to go to an interview to try to get the commission to do this project. And I thought, when we submitted, it was total long shot. I mean, here we are in Providence, Rhode Island. This is Plymouth, Mass, one of the most important historic towns in Massachusetts. We submitted a proposal, we got shortlisted, and I was like, well, okay, I'll go for an interview, but I didn't think that we had a snowball's chance. We were up against some very prominent Boston architects to get this project. So we're doing the interview and making a presentation. And each of the people on the panel had a question to ask. And usually you kind of know what kind of questions they're going to ask, and you come very well prepared. And somebody said, describe something that you found on a project that was unanticipated, and what did you do about it? And I was like, and the only thing that came into my head was the clock. So I thought, well, I was working on the Newport Casino and I found this clock and the clock tower, blah, blah, blah. And I told the story briefly that I just told you. And I walked away thinking, there's no way I got that project. And lo and behold, we were hired. And later on, the town manager told me that we were hired because of the clock story. So you never know sort of how these things are going to play out. But it was a really interesting project. I'm so honored to have been able to make a small contribution to the town of Plymouth. It's a wonderful town. They were great people to work with. This project went on for years because it was very complex. But in the end, we restored the 1820 courthouse, which you see on the right of the bigger image, completely restored that building, which has a very long and storied history in and of itself. We removed some of the later additions which had been added to it over time behind the courthouse. And it's a steep slope. You probably couldn't tell from the aerial, but from the courthouse in the circle to the other end of that red rectangle is probably 2 stories worth of slope. It's quite a big site and a lot of change in elevation. And in the bottom of this image, you can see that there's a historic burial ground. So if you want to have a really sensitive site to work within, this is a very important historic burial ground right across the street from our site. And part of that burial ground had already been carved out for a parking lot, not the actual burial ground, but right immediately adjacent to it. So we determined that, yes, we could restore the courthouse, and yes, we could create a new municipal facility for the town, but it would require a really large addition because all the departments that they needed to accommodate required a lot of square footage. So we had to design an addition that was really sensitive to this very important 1820 courthouse. And the courthouse faces a green on the main street in Plymouth. So it's a very prominent site. And the whole basis for our design was to preserve the courthouse and keep it as the jewel in the crown and make the new additions sit kind of comfortably behind it and have their own identity, but not an identity that competes with the courthouse. So you can see in this image the way the new construction sort of steps up the hill towards the top of the hill in the back of the complex. We created a little glass connector to make the transition from the historic courthouse to the new construction. And in that glass connector, we actually reconstructed a historic staircase that had been in one of the additions that we took down. The addition that we took down was not that architecturally significant, but in it was a very nice staircase, which we disassembled and reassembled in this glass connector. I think I have a picture of it. I'll see. And then as the building steps up the hill, on the high side is a residential neighborhood. So the building actually has to transition from this very prominent green in downtown Plymouth, and then it steps up the hill to a residential neighborhood. So by the time we get up here, we're down to 2.5 stories, and it has more of a residential scale to it than the very prominent courthouse at the other end of the complex. And within the courthouse, of course, we restored the original courtroom, which is where I think Daniel Webster gave a particular speech. It's been a number of years, so I can't remember all the particulars, but there's quite a bit of history that goes with this courtroom, that we restored. And when we started this project, this courtroom was white on white. Everything was painted white. It had vinyl windows, and it was pretty uninteresting. We restored the coffered ceiling. We did paint scraping. We hired John Vaughn to do paint scrapings to determine that there was stenciling on the walls and this polychromatic paint scheme in the courtroom. We recreated a historic carpet based on an article in a newspaper when the courtroom was used as a courtroom. So there wasn't, the only information we had about the carpeting in the courtroom was an article which said that it was red with a medallion pattern and some gold. And so we had very little to go by. We worked with a consultant who specializes in historic carpets. And he said, well, during that time period, if it had red and gold, here are some possibilities. So we put something back that fit the descriptions and is of the period, but we don't know if it's exactly the carpet that was there. And as you can see in the left-hand image, there's a clock on the wall. There's no story behind it, but we did restore this, yet another clock. One of the most difficult and time-consuming parts of this project was designing the public restrooms. So we're coming full circle back to the story of the ladies' room. In this project, the town wanted to have public restrooms that could be available to visitors and tourists when town hall was closed. So they were part of the project, they were part of the building, but they needed to operate completely independently of town hall. So these two little pavilions that you see right here on the left side of the building are men's and women's public restrooms. And they have this little plaza between them so that there's a place to gather. And it's the, you know, when the tourist season is really going in Plymouth, there's a great need for public restrooms. And so these are operating that way. And the various components that you see here, the granite piers, we designed those piers to provide signage and to provide light. Those little lanterns are something that we created out of salvaged granite that came from the buildings that were torn down on the site. So when we tore down later buildings, there were some really great pieces of granite. So we used that salvaged granite throughout the site in the new construction. So those two piers are made from stone that came from the site. The two little blocks that you see in the foreground are benches that we made out of salvaged granite. The curbing that you see there, all that came from the buildings that were torn down. And then that image on the back wall is a historic image of Plymouth, so that when people are sitting around waiting for the restrooms, they have something interesting to look at. So one town hall sort of leads to another. A couple of years after we were awarded that project, we also competed for a town hall project, a city hall project actually in Taunton, Massachusetts. And we were awarded this project probably because of our experience in Plymouth. This one was really similar to the Plymouth project in that what we started with was this granite building to the left, and it had suffered a fire. Ring a bell? The Taunton City Hall suffered a fire while the City Hall employees were in the building. This was in the, I forget the year, but they think it was arson. Somebody lit a fire on an upper floor. They had to evacuate the building, of course. There was considerable damage inside the building, but the granite shell was completely intact. Taunton City Hall moved out for, it's like 10 years, and they did studies and eventually hired us to build a new city hall. But again, the original granite building that you see here is not very big, and the city of Taunton had many departments that needed to be accommodated. So at the end of the day, we restored the granite building, put the mayor's office on the top floor, put several departments within the granite building, but also built a really big addition. What you see on the right, the small pavilion, is a brand new building that houses the council chambers. So that's the most public facing piece of the design. And the plaza in front of it is so that when there are public council meetings, they can sort of spill out into the plaza and encourage people to come in from downtown. And there's a little, very small park or plaza where people can hang out in front of City Hall. And then on the lower right-hand image, you can see that there's again, a glass connector between the new construction and the old construction. And we tried to make the new construction very sensitive to the historic building, but again, not compete with it. So it's set back, it's smaller, it's respectful of the historic building, but hopefully it's designed well in and of its own right. And this site too is very steep, and on the back side, it's a full story taller. So that little pavilion You can see in the right-hand image, the pavilion with the council chamber is on the left, and now it has another story because we've stepped down the hill. So on the lower level is the treasurer's department, and all the parking happens on this level. So this back entrance, which we call the Riverside entrance, because there's a river back here, is very, very active. That's where the parking is. And so that's where we put the most actively used departments, like the treasurer and the tax assessor. And then the public spaces on the next floor up spill out onto the main street. That's the city council chamber. That's brand new in that pavilion. That was designed to be a multi-purpose space and to have some traditional finishes, but also to feel very much like a product of its own time, not like the 1898 building next door. And when we did the dedication for this project, it was actually at the beginning of COVID, and you can see that people are masked here as well. And when we started this project, there was a mayor who was a man. And when we finished the project, in the upper image is the new mayor, who's a woman. So we started designing this project for one client, and then the new mayor took office. And she was fortunately very pleased with the design because she became mayor when it was under construction. And this is at the dedication. So no, I am not running for office. I just was asked to speak at the dedication. So finally, because the mayor was a woman, this is another stretch. I'm going to talk about buildings designed for women. We are currently working on 3 Peabody and Stearns buildings that were all designed for or occupied by prominent women. Peabody and Stearns was a very prominent Boston architect in the late 19th century. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because of time limitations, but one of the buildings we're currently working on is Rough Point in Newport, which Doris Duke inhabited. Doris Duke was the longest inhabitant of this building. It wasn't designed for Doris Duke. It was designed for the Vanderbilt family originally by Peabody and Stearns, but Doris Duke's father ended up purchasing it, and she was its longest occupant. So we're doing a complete exterior restoration of Rough Point right now, and also wrapping up a strategic stewardship plan, which is a historic structures report and a planning document. So it's a pretty big 432-page document that the Newport Restoration Foundation will use for to gather all the history of the property and to look forward in terms of what they do with the property in the future. So this is the first of the 3 Peabody and Stearns buildings that we're currently working on that all are associated with important women. This is also Rough Point. If you haven't been there, you should go to Newport. You should visit Rough Point. It is the coolest site in Newport, in my opinion. They called it Rough Point for a reason. It's this rocky, craggy promontory that sticks out into the Atlantic/Block Island Sound, and it's amazing. It's a really cool site. We are also working on a property called Midcliff in Newport, which is not one of the better known Newport mansions. It's in private ownership. And these images show the before photographs because it's currently completely under construction. But Peabody and Stearns designed this for Caroline Ogden Jones. So it's kind of unusual that in the 1890s that it was being designed for a woman. I think her father had something to do with that. But again, Peabody and Stearns were designing this house for a woman. And it has a really neat carriage house. So the 2 right-hand images show the carriage house at Midcliff, which has been heavily altered, but which we're trying to bring back to something that more closely resembles the way it was historically and the relationship it had with the main house. And we were able to find original Olmsted drawings of the site. Olmsted, by coincidence, worked on the landscape for Rough Point and the landscape for this project and the next one I'm going to talk about. Peabody and Stearns' original drawings are in the Boston Public Library in their archives. The Boston Public Library archives are being renovated. We can't get any of the original Peabody and Stearns drawings for any of these projects, which is really frustrating. But we did get some original Olmsted drawings of this site that showed all the development around the carriage house, the paddock, the horse area. It's just really interesting to see how the carriage house functioned. The third project that we're working on that was designed by Peabody and Stearns is Mary Baker Eddy's last home in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, which is part of Newton. Peabody and Stearns designed this building in the late 1890s, and Mary Baker Eddy only occupied it for 2 years, but it was her last home. And this house also has a very cool carriage house. So my new love is carriage houses. So all these projects have really interesting carriage houses. And this one has a carriage house and gatehouse combined, and it's the carriage house part of it is completely intact inside. And so we're restoring that as well as part of the restoration of the overall Peabody and Stearns property. Finally, this is the other image that you saw in the beginning. The one on the right, I think, is the one I included on the title slide. This is my carriage house. I bought a property 5 years ago with my husband, and it had a crumbling carriage house. It was in really rough shape. Most people would have torn this carriage house down. In fact, the house was advertised as a tear down, but we didn't tear down the house either. So at first I thought, oh, I'll just paint it and see, you know, just keep it as a garage. And then I just fell in love with the carriage house and started to think about what it could become. And it was, not only were the walls, the brick foundation walls were collapsing. The floor inside the carriage house was unsafe to walk on because it was hollow underneath and it was rotten. The roof was leaking and there were plants growing through all the windows. But we restored it because I'm crazy, and we turned the second floor into an apartment. The apartment is entered through the far door on the right on the first floor. And we kept all the original features from the carriage house, which included in the right-hand image, these large sliding barn doors. That door was on the first floor, but I had the contractors take it upstairs and rehang it on its sliding track. So it creates a separation between the living room and the bedroom. And the loft doors that you see in red on the second floor open inside to create a Juliet balcony. So here's those doors opening in. You can see the sliding barn door on the left, the Juliet balconies. This is a bedroom on the right and a living room on the left. Very small. It's a tiny apartment, but it was so much fun to figure out the sort of geometry of this tiny little second floor, which was the hayloft, by the way, of the carriage house. And we tried to save as much as humanly possible. And we have a horse that pokes his head out of the original windows where the horses would have stuck their heads out. So that's it. That's the career of a preservation architect in 30 minutes. Did I do it? No, I spoke too long. Questions?
That was really great. Exactly. We can have some questions and then we'll move to the next room.
I'm scared because Ned's going to ask a hard question.
No, this is an easy one. When we had the preservation conference at the casino, the French casino, it was pointed out to us that there was a space underneath the chairs for storage of top hats. Could you just tell us about that?
Yeah.
And what the preservation issues were?
See if that shows up at all. You have a good memory. Okay, here we go. So the theater was built in 1880. By the way, this Stanford White had just joined McKim, Mead and White. This was his first commission, and he just returned from his grand tour in Europe. He was 26 years old. Can you imagine? So the casino theater was designed in 1880. In 1920, and it was designed as a ballroom because in 1880, the Newport mansions didn't have their own ballrooms. So the people in Newport who wanted to have balls had a kind of a communal space inside the Newport casino for balls. And it had a flat floor and a stage, and it was sort of operated as a cabaret. And there was this balcony around the perimeter that you can see in the right-hand image. So it was very flexible with the flat floor and the stage and the balcony, and they would have balls there. In 1927, they converted into just a theater space, and they added several things, including all the cushioned theater chairs that you can sort of see in green in this picture. They're folding chairs, they have velvet covers, and they're the original seats from 1927. And they're the kind of seats that automatically flip up. So when you get up, it goes bing. And when it goes bing, you can see a wire frame on the bottom of the seat. It's just the outline of something. And what it was a wire loop that a gentleman could put his top hat into. So when you went to the theater and you were wearing a top hat, you could take it off and you could slide it into this wire frame and sit down, you know, fold the seat down and sit, and your top hat wouldn't get crushed. Isn't that thoughtful? Now they should do something like that for women's handbags, right?
So who figured out that that's, because I would have been like,
What the heck is that?
what the heck is that? It's my purse. That's what
Yeah,
I'm putting
yeah, but it's a wire frame that like you can't hold anything but a top hat. I don't know the answer to that. I think that information was available when we started the project. I think the folks at the Tennis Hall of Fame, you all know that the Newport Casino is owned and operated by the International Tennis Hall of Fame. I should have said that. Because it has all the grass courts. So the Tennis Hall of Fame has their museum there, and they operate the grass tennis courts, and they have many famous tennis tournaments there. I think, and they have an archives and everything. I think they knew that that's what those were for. I certainly didn't. I can't take credit for that discovery. Sure.
Other question. Are there particular kinds of historic structures that are easier or harder to reuse?
That's a good question. So my projects cover a really wide range of historic structures, and we call it preservation with a capital P versus adaptive reuse. So preservation with a capital P is this, right? Where you're restoring ornate interiors, you're not making any changes, or you're making as few changes as possible. This house is preservation with a capital P. Then there are, you know, sort of preservation projects like the 2 town halls where there's a big addition. That's strict preservation of part of the project and brand new construction. Then there are buildings that aren't as architecturally or historically significant that we can transform completely. Waterfire that Diedrich mentioned is a good example of that. That was a fairly simple industrial building that our firm converted to, you know, it's performing arts, it's Waterfire, it's a very flexible building. So the question is, which are easy and which are hard? They're all challenging, and they're all easy or hard for different reasons. I would say the capital P preservation is probably the hardest, because you really have to have a lot of technical knowledge of what to preserve and how. Like, I remember being on a committee with Angela Brown Fisher and trying to figure out, where are we going to get this reproduction wallpaper, this reproduction silk? It's not wallpaper, but how are we going to do that? How are we going to reproduce? This is the original curtains reproduced. This library was crumbling, literally crumbling. This library was built as a fireproof structure. So there were wood studs with brick between the studs to enhance its fireproofing capabilities. And the brick combination with the wood studs caused the wood studs to rot. So that was a technical challenge. So I'll go on and on, but there's not a building type that's harder or easier, and every project has its own set of challenges. Some of them many more challenges than others.
You know, a lot of the industrial projects you've worked on, there were issues of toxics, you know, toxic waste and
Right.
all that sort of stuff, which you don't run across necessarily in the residential area.
Right. Some projects we've had to introduce ventilation systems underground to get rid of the toxic gases that exist underground, and we have to ventilate them well above the building so that the toxins are distributed into the atmosphere. And I always wonder, why is that a good idea? And they don't affect the inhabitants, but there is an approved way of doing that, where you can suck toxic gases out of the ground and get them way up above the roof so that the building inhabitants aren't affected by them. We did that at Alco, American Locomotive Works, over on the west side. I think we've done that in a few locations. Yes.
How has public support for historic preservation changed?
Great question. I want to say it's improved. It's also waxed and waned, if that's the right terminology. The first Preservation Act by the feds was in 1976, and then the historic tax credits, I think, were introduced in 1986. And so in the late 80s and 90s, there was a huge amount of work associated with the federal tax credits that helped to support projects. So there was a whole lot of public money available for historic projects in the 80s and 90s. And then there was, in Rhode Island and several other states, a state historic tax credit that could be piggybacked onto the federal historic tax credit. So that created a lot of interest and work and investment by developers. For better or for worse, there were a lot of developers who were only there because the tax incentives existed. And I would say it's a good thing, because a heck of a lot of buildings got saved that wouldn't have been saved otherwise. Were they all saved perfectly? No, but there was a huge investment in historic buildings. Then the state tax credit went away, and then the federal tax credit, which still exists, became a little bit less valuable. There's a renewed interest in, well, we've always tried to get the state historic tax credits back, which would help with things like the Superman building and many other historic buildings. But I think there's a greater public awareness of and appreciation for historic buildings. There's not necessarily funding right now, public funding, but there is interest. So it's kind of, you know, done this a little bit, but I feel like there's a lot of public interest. Maybe that's just the people I hang out with, though. Yes.
Are you fully preserving the other carriage houses you talked about, or are those being
Yes.
repurposed as well?
So the one at Midcliff, I'll go real fast here. This is Midcliff, which is in private ownership. This carriage house is being restored. It had been altered a lot, but we're trying to bring it back to something closer to what it was originally. I would be able to do that better if I had the Peabody and Stearns drawings and I could see what it looked like originally. But we're trying to bring it back as much as possible. It's going to have a residential unit inside, so the interior is going to be new, but we're trying to save that carriage house as much as possible. At the Mary Baker Eddy estate, this carriage house, the bigger of these two volumes is that had original carriages in it, and they have many historic carriages from Mary Baker Eddy's time. So not only are we restoring everything inside, the beadboard, the stalls, the tack cabinet, but it's going to have old carriages in it as well. And the lower level, which you can see in the right-hand image, was cow stalls, and we're restoring that area as well. Well, no, but probably for storage, but we're keeping everything that's there. And then the right-hand piece of this is a gatehouse, and the executive director, we're renovating that because it had been largely changed inside. So that's not a restoration inside, it's a renovation. So it's more creating a new apartment inside that looks like it could have been there. I mean, we're not trying to replicate historic finishes, but create something that feels right for the building. And that'll be the executive director's residence. But the two-story piece, the big piece, it's definitely going to be restored with carriages. So hopefully in about a year, you'll be able to go up and visit the property and see all this. Yes.
You mentioned the drawings and the photograph found, and that inspired you to do the preservation in a certain way, the preservation of capital P. So I want to ask, what other resources have been useful throughout your work that have guided you towards how, I know it's not an identical replica,
Yeah,
but what has guided you?
that's interesting. Any number of things. When we start a project, we try to gather all the information we can find: architectural drawings, reports, old photographs, old postcards, whatever we can find, information from people who have been associated with the site or the building for a long time. Regardless of whether or not we're going to do preservation with a capital P, we try to get as much information as we can, because it always informs, excuse me, what we're going to do, even if we're going to change something. The best resource is usually the old drawings and old photographs. Old photographs are tricky because you can only get so much information from an old photograph. This old postcards are even trickier because sometimes they're colorized and sometimes they're false representation. Often they're false representations. Like we had several historic postcards of Midcliff, and they all looked very much like it had a slate roof. but we found physical evidence that it had a wood roof. So, and all these old postcards had a gray roof that totally looked like slate, but we found evidence that it was wood. So we get as much information as we can, that historic photograph of the billiard room that showed the flames. Anything like that is really, really helpful. Even if we're not going to restore that flame motif, it's great to have whatever documentation we can find. So when we start a project, we want it all, and then we figure out how best to integrate it into the project.
I was also very impressed with the new structures that you built next to the old ones and how contextual they were. I thought that was
Thank you.
very
That's,
convincing and fantastic. That's very hard. And
that is hard, and it's,
exactly that.
yeah, thanks.
I wish we could have more of that. Sometimes we need more coherence of the campus, not just individual pieces that stand out. That's such an amazing job. So
Oh, thank you.
I wonder if we could move to the next room. There's plenty of food and great wine and sparkling water for those who are under age.
That's me, by the way.
But I wanted to.
And the glass I dropped was empty. So,
Ask you to thank Martha one more time.
thank you.